Welcome, everyone, to our New Jersey Community College Practitioner Scholars webinar series. We're so delighted you could join us today for the last webinar of the spring 2024 semester. Feature Dr. Leah Johnson, Associate Vice President and Dean of Students at Passaic County Community College. Before I turn it over to Dr. Johnson, I just want to let everyone know that we'll have some time for questions and answers at the end. If you have a question and want to put it in the chat, we'll address it at the end. If you want to hold your questions to the end and ask once we get to that point, please do so. And without further ado, let me turn it over to Dr. Leah Johnson. Dr. Johnson, thank you so much for doing this for us today.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here and be part of all the presentations. There's been so many other great presentations that have gone on before me, so I'm so glad to be part of this series as well. So I'm going to hop right into it. I am the Associate Vice President, Dean of Student Affairs at Passaic County Community College, and my research was really something I enjoyed doing because it allowed me to really express my passion and what I've been observing over my years of experience. So over the past 25 years or so, I've worked extensively within nonprofit management and higher education, dealing a lot, seeing a lot with mid-level leaders, mid-level managers, and really getting a chance to really see how they were prepared, developed, and being one of those mid-level leaders at those various times, dealing with the weight, the responsibility, the roles, as many of us here know, that come with that role. So my research really looked at the impact of coaching-based leadership on mid-level leaders' preparation and retention in higher education, and it was a qualitative study. For the sake of this study, mid-level leaders, as I had defined them for this study, were individuals serving in interim director roles, deans, or assistant vice president roles, generally individuals who oversaw staff, divisions, departments, and managed budgets. So individuals that generally had those roles. I looked specifically within higher education because higher education has been my love, but I also thought it was interesting during this time, the national trends that we were seeing within higher education and many of the changes and the that we in higher education have been experiencing everything from there's been growth and there's been organizational declines. There have been closeouts, there's been the pandemic, there's been change of key leadership, so many things, and the projections of what our numbers will look like in these many years and if people will go to higher ed, what does that mean? But looking specifically, what does that mean for the mid-level leaders who are in the trenches and in the roles? So looking at higher ed and the population of mid-level leaders, I started to get into this work a little bit. So I looked closely at coaching-based leadership training, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that in a moment. But I was looking at that and its development, and a lot of the research demonstrated how it can have a positive effect, not just on the individual who's being developed or trained, but on organizational success. And then there's all these additional impacts on the impact on higher employee engagement, increased productivity, economic benefits to the institution due to the retention of key leadership. So as I was looking at the research, we could really see how coaching-based leadership training can have long-term impacts on your institution overall. Findings definitely demonstrate that there are major implications, specifically when you're thinking about organizations in decline, with leaders in need of support, coaching-based leadership training. And I would like to say that I was blessed with the opportunity to research an institution that was dealing with a myriad of issues, which is, I think, reflective of a lot of institutions, but they were dealing with a lot of levels, which allowed me to see a little more intricacies into the role and responsibilities of the mid-level leaders there. So if you're talking about potential historical organizational decline, you're talking about financial changes, you're talking about change in key leadership, you're talking about the height of potential closeout, you're talking about the change of priorities based on pandemic and its impact on shift. So that really added some color and some context to the research. So I really want to look at what I thought was the problem here, which was the absence of a coaching-based leadership development program for mid-level leaders at this institution that I studied. And the purpose of this exploratory qualitative case study was to really determine, was there even a demand for coaching-based leadership approaches by those mid-level leaders who were right there in the trenches at that institution? So we got into that a little bit. So first I wanted to ask, my first question is, okay, what is the demand for coaching-based leadership development training for mid-level leaders' performance? Is there a demand for that here? We know there's an absence, but are we just doing the work and we don't think we need it? So I wanted to dig into that a little bit. And then my second was, well, if there is coaching-based leadership training or practices, what's the influence of that on subordinate employee performance? Because of what I was finding in terms of the impact on organizations overall and the literature. So I want to ask those questions specifically of this population in this institution because of what they were dealing with. So I took an integrated theoretical framework approach, and I was looking at succession planning. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that, coaching-based leadership and action frame theory. As I told you when I first started, I was looking at the impact of the roles of middle managers in nonprofits, mid-level leaders in higher education, but also the different ways that they were prepared. And depending on the institution, certain industries are very big on having succession planning. You know exactly what you need to do to get to certain roles, what steps you need to take, what departments to get involved in. And then some places did not have it. There were other places that were very key about coaching-based leadership, preparing people in their roles. And then from what I found from nonprofit and higher education, there were other places that were very clear about action frame theory. And so when we talk about action frame theory, that's by Kosevere and Cronshaw and in 2004, that's really talking about conditions, the means, the action, the result, and the consequences. And that really, in this sense, helped to put structure to the coaching. Okay, where are we going? What's the conditions that we're dealing with? What are the means and the action? And it's important to look at that because the conditions of every institution is not the same. Coaching-based leadership, also known as coaching leadership theory from John Whitmore in 1980, who's really known well for the GROW model, but it's expanded since that time, really got into depth about showing employees learning and ability to adapt to change, and that it's enhanced by coaching practices such as support and guidance rather than just instruction and directives. Now, the key thing about coaching-based leadership is the ability to adapt to change. And if we are in higher education, are in a constant changing field, we have to think about how we're preparing our mid-level leaders to learn and to be able to adapt to change through this support. And it's really about the ability for leaders to guide and to develop and to direct their direct reports and employees by a number of areas. So it's not just about certain types of leadership styles, but it's really about inspiring, motivating, developing the employees to reach their professional potential, but in the sense of how it impacts the overall structure. So there's some more nuance to coaching-based leadership. And then succession planning. Rothwell's 1994 leadership succession theory really talk about succession planning and management as a process. So a very intentional process to retain key personnel, assure performance effectiveness, and strategically develop talent for replacement positions. So again, depending on the priorities of the institution or industry you're in, you'll either see succession planning or you will not. In higher education, we haven't often seen that deliberate and intentional succession planning as you would in other business industries. We may see some elements of coaching-based leadership. We may or may not be as intentional about action framing. And so my research really called for an integration of these theoretical frameworks to really be able to address the mid-level leader role's complexities. We're not just talking about one position, we're talking about the complexities of being that intermediary between senior level strategic priorities, knowing what the priorities are of the college, what the demands may be, and also being the in-between between your employees and those that are dealing with direct service. So the call for the integration of succession planning, coaching-based leadership, and action frame theory provides that theoretical framework to really be able to frame the responsibilities and the context and the role of mid-level leadership.
But the conversation is going to be, but one thing
So in terms of methodology and instrumentation, so I conducted my research in two phases. The first phase, I utilized a questionnaire, Zuber-Buehler's 2021 Coaching-Based Leadership Scale. Now, this has been used in businesses internationally in Spain. So as per my research at the time, this was the first time that this scale was utilized within a research study here in the States, as per my research at that time. So I was really excited to be able to use this scale. Now, the coaching-based leadership scale is made up of two sections where an individual responds from the employee perspective and then also responds from the leader perspective on a 7-point Likert type scale. So it gives you two perspectives of how they are operating as leaders, but also people that have supervisors over them. Phase two were structured interviews for those that decided to continue on from phase one into phase two. And then because of my role and my position where I was at that time, I was able to use ethnographic observations to support or to complement some of the findings. So there were many findings about mid-level leaders that I found within the literature that addressed mid-level leader retention, their success, the impact of mid-level leaders' success on employee performance, employee perceptions of their leaders, employee perception of organizational culture, and employee engagement and retention. There were other themes within the literature in terms of how MLL impacted organizational success, how mid-level leaders, when I say MLL, I'm referencing mid-level leaders, influenced organizational outcomes, productivity, competitive advantage, turnaround success, or organizational decline. So that was interesting to see institutions that were in organizational decline were able to experience turnaround success by what was used to develop mid-level leaders. So that was many of the things that I found within the literature. Now, some of these same themes were also prevalent within my research studies. So there were 4 main themes and a sub-theme that kept demonstrating itself throughout the different themes. One were the external disruptions. And when we're talking about external disruptions, we're talking about historical context of organizational decline, financial change. We're talking about pandemic. We're talking about historical decline and trends of enrollments and external disruptions. I also found lack of structure. So lack of structure in developing your mid-level leaders was something that was also consistent in this study. Varied leadership guidance. And when I'm talking about varied leadership guidance, I am talking about key leadership that not only were revolving in terms of leaving during key times of change, but also different styles in varied leadership and how they led their mid-level leaders. Clear goals framework was another theme. Was the clear goals framework there? Was everyone clear about the objectives, the strategic priorities, but also what are the results? What are the outcomes? What are the actions that we need to take? So the ambiguity about clear goals framework. And throughout each of these findings in the study, there was this constant reference to a learning loop. Whether you were dealing with external disruptions and constantly being in this learning loop, lack of structure, constantly in this learning loop, and any of the other themes as well. So some of the findings in the research. So remember research question, I'm like, well, what is even the demand for coaching-based leadership on mid-level leaders' performance? Because there could have been a really good chance that mid-level leaders said, hey, we know what we do. We're just in the trenches. We roll up our sleeves. We don't need it. So mid-level leaders, the few who did, who expressed favorable guidance or that they received some type of feedback, coaching, or modeling from their supervisors, reported that they had that only after multiple changes in leadership, which means it wasn't uniformed across the institution and it was really dependent on the style of their leader. Most of the mid-level leaders in the study expressed they did not have any guidance along clear objectives, goals, or learning outcomes for their role, for the condition that the institution was experiencing, and the direction they needed to go. Now, as you remember, phase one was the questionnaire, and phase one of research demonstrated that there was a lack of coaching-based leadership approaches in leading these mid-level leaders. So mid-level leaders were thrown in multiple roles. Some of them were great at what they did. We know how that is, right? And you take on another role because you're like, yes, I can do it. And then there's this learning loop. And there really aren't any coaching-based leadership approaches that were implemented to lead these mid-level leaders. Phase 2, which were the structured interviews, really gave a lot more depth and context how they reported in the questionnaire. And it really impacted the lack of coaching-based leadership on mid-level leaders' performance, and that there was a need for them to be successful in their performance. Many mid-level leaders in the study that were confident and strong in their areas, once placed into another position or had an added role, began to question their ability, their capability, their confidence in their ability to do this new role. 100% of the mid-level leaders in this research reported challenges in their performance. It may not all have been the same way, but challenges, and it was due to the number of themes that emerged through phase 2. Some that I mentioned, some referenced the external disruptions, some were talking about the lack of structure. Any of the themes that I previously mentioned were the reasons behind some of these people, these mid-level leaders' challenges. So in terms of finding for research question 1, there was consistent variation in the manner, frequency, and consistency of CBL practices with MLL, coaching-based leadership practices with mid-level leaders. And remember, one of the things that I talked about with this integrated approach was to be intentional about the integration of succession planning with coaching-based leadership and action framing for the long-term effects beyond the individual, but beyond our silos in higher ed, right? Beyond our division, but in terms of overall organizational success, productivity, etc. So for some who had the experiences, some who did not, I wanted to look at, well, is there any impact on their direct reports? If mid-level leaders aren't receiving it or they've had it in some capacity, how is this translated to the people that they lead? So phase 1, the questionnaire, as I had explained previously, which was 2 sections, one section being they respond from the employee perspective, and then they also respond from a leader perspective. Phase 1 portrayed the overwhelming self-report of support for coaching-based leadership approaches with their employees. So when mid-level leaders answered this questionnaire as a leader, they tended to demonstrate more coaching-based leadership practices in terms of modeling, directing, being a little clearer in their approaches with their employees. So without coaching-based leadership training or without consistent coaching-based leadership supervisory practices and experiences modeled, these mid-level leaders still reported favorable results for demonstrating these practices with their employees, which was interesting because this speaks to some of the complexities of mid-level leaders being that intermediary between knowing senior level priorities, organizational needs, some of the external disruptions and its impact, and also being on the ground with their employees with direct service. So it really spoke to their response to the complexities of the roles. From the interviews with mid-level leaders, the respondents expressed a keen awareness of the impact of the different themes on their staff. So they were very cognizant about how their staff were responding to varied leader structure, lack of structure, not a clear framework in terms of what was happening in the college at that time. They had a clear awareness of the influence of the state of the college on their staff's transition and a responsibility to help their staff transition well. There was a strong emphasis on the leadership guidance mid-level leaders gave to their employees. So even if they did not receive it themselves, they felt this need or responsibility to demonstrate some element of this with their own employees because they recognized that their staff, like they were themselves, were in this constant learning loop, responding to the conditions of their environment because of the external disruptions or lack of structure or turnover in staff. So respondents were clear about their endorsement. They were like, yes, we need a coaching-based leadership uniform program for all staff, not just mid-level leaders, senior level leaders, entry-level leaders, across levels of leadership, as well as a clear succession plan that would encompass that. Where are we going? How do we get there? And how are we supported to get there? So to research question 1, 100% of my mid-level leaders in this research struggled in their performance and their confidence in their roles, and it was attributed to the various themes. Research question 2, 100% of the mid-level leaders demonstrated more coaching-based leadership attributes with their own staff because of their awareness of the various factors impacting the college. And this speaks a little bit to the complexities of mid-level leader roles, our responsibilities, and what we tend to know on the campus level. So throughout the research, there were some recommendations, if I ever found the time, that I would definitely love to do, but I've seen other research being done along the same context. So I'm happy to see that. But I think my first recommendation would be to replicate this same study with mid-level leaders from multiple institutions of higher education, just to see, is there any difference, or is this the nature of mid-level leaders? My second recommendation, I think, would be for future researchers to really decide to build on the study. Can we do a longitudinal study? Can we compare two similar institutions, one that doesn't have an integrated coaching-based leadership program and another one that does? So have that control and experimental group, and maybe that data would give us some varying degrees of the impact of mid-level leaders, preparation, retention, and success in higher education. Thirdly, I would say future researchers may want to explore the development of empathetic leadership. And that was a surprising finding that came from my research that I did not expect, that many of the mid-level leaders demonstrated empathetic leadership, putting themselves in the place of their employees because they were highly aware of all the other factors that were involved. And these were individuals that were deans, they were assistant VPs, they ran departments, or they were faculty, or they were administrators, but had all these similar experiences that could really add to empathetic leadership theories. But I'm a practical kind of person as well, so I definitely want to give some other recommendations. But before I say that, so my study expanded on the literature of mid-level leaders because most of the research around mid-level leaders dealt with two-year colleges, mid-level leaders. A lot of great research that I fell in love with about two-year colleges and mid-level leaders. But by researching mid-level leaders in a four-year institution in transition, my research really adds knowledge to mid-level leaders' impact on organizational sustainability. Again, I mentioned before, this research builds on Rothwell's succession planning theory, Whitmore's coaching-based leadership theory, and Kosavera and Cranshaw's action framing theory as an intentional, integrated process for mid-level leaders. But lastly, I want to give recommendations as a practitioner. So I did fall in love with doing research and doing it in depth and adding to theories. But me being a sort of in the trenches kind of person, I'm always thinking, okay, how can I apply this as a practitioner? And I think because as being in higher education and knowing the changes that's happening in higher education and what we have seen now, even within higher ed, that I think my first recommendation is really any one of us can do this. Identify, is there even a succession plan that exists in your institution? Now, note that it's not as, you don't find it as often in higher education, clearly outlined as you do in businesses and other organizations. So that's definitely a difference in the industry, but is there even a succession plan that exists in your institution? And if it does, is it uniformed across HR or through other departments? My second recommendation, if you're really serious about seeing how you can change the culture of mid-level leaders on your campus, is there a campus coaching-based leadership program? Some institutions have that. Or are there funds that are invested for professional development for all staff, specifically in coaching-based leadership? So the main question is this information readily available to all? And is it shared through initial onboarding? I think my third recommendation for practitioners is, as part of the succession planning and coaching-based leadership training, are all directors and leaders trained to provide clear action frameworks for all staff? Okay, remember, clear action frameworks, we're looking at conditions. What's the condition of my environment? What are my means, right? What are the results and the consequences? What's the clear goals, expectations, and outcomes? And does that translate into productivity and successful promotion? Okay. And my last recommendation for us as practitioners, if none of the above are available, or they're only available in silos, certain departments are really doing them well, are you willing to engage HR? senior leadership, and possibly financial administration into the conversation. And the reason why you would like to have these key stakeholders is because from the literature, we find mid-level leaders can impact organizational success, economic productivity. It can help to decrease turnover within higher ed as well. So those are some of my wrap up recommendations as a practitioner as well. Thank you.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing this. Let's turn to the audience here. Does anyone have any questions based on what we just learned? I may have a couple questions, but I'll defer to all of you throughout the state. Anyone have questions or comments?
I do, but
Candace,
I don't
go
want to go
ahead.
first.
No, you can go first, please. Please go ahead.
So, first of all, congratulations, because wow, that was impressive.
Thank you.
We sit on a lot of things, but you don't always walk away with all of that in a nice package. So thank you for that. I missed part of the beginning, so I don't know if you showed it. Where did you get your supervisors from? Like, were they all like, they're in higher ed, but were they all in New Jersey? Was it like nationwide, or like where did you get some of the data to get the conclusions that you came to?
Sure. So I used one institution. All the mid-level leaders were within this one institution, which is why my recommendation was to do this across a couple of institutions located all in the same area.
Okay. Yeah, I'm all in. Let's do it.
So let's talk.
Yes. So, well, we just did a panel of experts, this whole thing, and somebody came up to the one panelist who is an executive coach like myself, and I know you are too. And he said, "Hey, can you come in?" And we're, "Oh, yes, please let us come in because," and now you have the data in higher ed. So if we can talk offline, because I don't know if other people have questions, but
Sure.
that would be great.
Sure.
And hi, Jake. How are you?
Hi, Candace. Good to see you. Candace and I are familiar friends, two proud Salem Community College alumni. Any other questions? I have a couple questions. It's always like you got to get somebody to break the ice, then other people ask questions, right? So I was curious. You had spoken, Leah, about the external challenges. Your first research question, the external challenges that the mid-level leaders had faced. You mentioned predominantly the pandemic. I was curious if there were any other stressors that rose to the top. They don't necessarily need to be external challenges, but any of those other factors you had shown in your slideshow and the different categories. Were there any like specific that they might not have risen to the top, but they were like, well, wait a minute, we need to take a further look at that?
Definitely. So, with this institution, we were talking about the impact of organizational decline. That was a huge impact on the role of the mid-level leaders there. So you had people that had been there for a long period of time, kind of got comfortable to what decline looked like, right? So it was like, okay, we're used to pivoting, taking on, scaling down. But we do, in my opinion, do a disservice when we take our staff to a good skeleton crew, but you have now put on all this work on these mid-level leaders, and they are responding to it because either they're committed to the institution, and a lot of individuals are committed to their institution. They're trying to roll with the punches with organizational decline, but yet they are not yet prepared well enough to be able to take on all those responsibilities. So they're dealing with these varied complexities of their role, and then you have burnout, you have turnover of key staff that at those points when you're dealing with those changes that you need to stay there. So that was another major one that was demonstrating itself with the people I was researching.
Well, I appreciate you sharing that because as you share that insight, it sounds as if not much has changed throughout the country, right? We still see if you read the ACCT newsletter or AACC Daily, you'll see from time to time where there's people leaving left and right, and it's the same cycle that you're talking about here from your research. So I appreciate you sharing that insight. Other questions, comments? I can't be
have
the
one
only one,
question.
folks. We're all wow. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Hi, Dr. Johnson.
Hi.
I had one question because as you know, I'm a student myself and trying to get my doctorate. And a couple semesters back, I was doing a study on empathetic management in healthcare and how that prevents burnout and some of the topics that you addressed. So I was wondering if the study location that you participated with actually took your empathetic management recommendation, and if so, how did that play out for them?
So thank you for that question. So I did not make the recommendation for them. It was one of my findings that across the board, every one of them demonstrated elements of empathetic leadership, which was really influential in keeping their staff. Right. So they, in their mind, they were like, I don't want to lose more staff. Right. And what can I do, even if it's not within my institution, but what can I do to better support my staff so that that helped to keep some of the key direct service individuals there. But that would definitely be something I would love to do further with them, like to create a coaching-based leadership training program with that institution, because it would not only keep the employees, but it would keep those mid-level leaders who tended to take on more because they were thinking about this, the senior level, and they're thinking about the employees, and they're trying to balance those complexities. But the impact of that is far reaching, like even like you found in the health area.
Great question, Byron. Thank you. Any other questions or comments? Any? Okay, well, I will let everyone know that we're going to make this available on the council's YouTube page. We're going to share this broadly throughout our social media networks and website and email listservs, the affinity groups, so on and so forth. And just want to thank you again, Dr. Johnson, for sharing this,
Thank you.
your research findings with us and opening our minds a bit this afternoon.
Thank you.
And for all of you on the line, thank you for attending our Practitioner Scholars webinar series this spring 2024 semester. Now, the good news is we do want to ramp this up again in the fall, and we'll be sending information out over the summer about submitting proposal ideas for those of you who are on the tail end to finish your doctorates, or you have finished your doctorates and you everyone has done important work. We'd like to share your learnings across the board throughout the state. So if you're interested in doing this in the fall semester, we'll have more information coming out soon enough. And so please keep your eyes open for that. And thank you all once again for joining us. Enjoy the rest of the day.